Harold Bloom is the resident American literary curmudgeon, a self-styled party of one against all. He is Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale, Berg Professor of English at New York University, author of more than 20 books, including The Anxiety of Influence, published in 1973, and his 1990 bestseller, The Book of J, in which he took on the Bible, arguing with brilliance that some of his favorite parts of the Pentateuch were written by a woman. He has edited and written introductions to some 400 volumes of literary criticism. Everything about him is outsized, an encyclopedic intellect, exuberant eccentricity, a massive love of literature.
Thank you, sir.
Now, I'm going to just start off slightly off-center with this book, because I was trying to find my baby's mouth with a bottle this morning at 4 a.m., and I suddenly had a kind of intuition that maybe what this was all about was, and you certainly mentioned this in the book several times, that there's a sense in which the Western canon itself has become too large, that no one man in his lifetime can now read it and understand it, absorb it all. And maybe part of this movement of resentment, which you are arguing against, is in fact a reaction to the fact that it is now no longer manageable.
I think that's very shrewd on your part. I've been obsessed all my life with an idea that, for want of a better term, I've called belatedness, the deep fear or sense that I think has haunted Western literature ever since ancient Alexandria in the opening centuries of the Common or Christian era, that we have come too late, that the great age is over. It is indeed true that if you take Western literature from its Greek and Hebraic origins down to the present moment, you have 3,000 years of the highest imaginative achievement. And difficult as it was to absorb in Alexandrian days 2,000 years ago, it is now indeed virtually impossible to absorb completely. And I would suppose that the phenomenon that I call resentment in the universities and colleges and schools, in the longest analysis, may perhaps be a version of that sense of belatedness.
Now, your new book, The Western Canon, published by Harcourt Brace, takes the canon. You argue cogently and also brilliantly for 26 central writers, ranging from Dante through Shakespeare, who you see as the centerpiece of the canon, to Samuel Beckett. You are using as a kind of model for this book a kind of modified Baconian theory of history, a cyclical theory of history, beginning with the theocratic age, moving to the aristocratic age, which Dante through Shakespeare, then the democratic age, and now the age that we're in now, the chaotic age, which you see as leading into another theocratic age. This idea that of belatedness, that the canon is now in some ways too large for one person to absorb. I wonder, you can almost sort of line that up with when a canon, when a culture's canon, when its sacred books, in a sense, become too weighty, then the culture itself begins a kind of decline. You can almost make a correlation there, or am I going too far now?
No, you have put it very shrewdly. Of course, to organize a book on this kind of serio-comic use of Vico's theory of history, in which rather clearly and overtly, and indeed by confession, I am following Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, which is quite certainly one of the canonical climaxes of our age. To use that kind of a paradigm is in some sense to confess that one is indeed, once again, a very belated kind of a figure in a very belated kind of a time. On the other hand, it has its comic aspect. It was Wallace Stevens who remarked with wonderful irony that the imagination is always at the end of an era. And that, I think, has marked what, broadly speaking, I would call Alexandrianism in the last 2,000 years. And we are all of us Alexandrians, whether we are resentniks or whether we are conservatives of the ghastly Gingrichian variety.
Yes.
Or whether we are, like myself, determined, last ditch, last stand, we will go down fighting aesthetes of the sort of Paterian or Wildean kind. We are, all of us, in that deep condition of Alexandrianism, of knowing that we come after rather than before. I think I remarked at one point in the book that if we lived not on average or balance the biblical 70 years, but if we double that, if we lived 140 years, then in a sense there would now be no canonical problem, no canonical dispute.
Right.
So even that is a kind of comic statement on my part. I think my book is an extremely serious book, but I hope that, like any book that has any value whatsoever, it is also a comic work by design, as Finnegan's Wake is a profoundly comic kind of an achievement.
Comic. It certainly has a very elegiac ring, at least at the introduction, at the end, which are both...
Well, I think, as I say, that we have lost the war, that readers like myself, and there are a good many of us more outside the academies now, I fear, than inside them, people who really, from the time they were children, had a deep, solitary, passionate love of reading above any other activity of the heart or spirit or indeed the human, that we are more and more in the minority, that a belated age is also an ideological age, and clearly the great disease that I'm trying to fight in the book is ideology. Indeed, it does not matter whether it is the right-wing ideology of someone like that wretched fellow William Bennett, or whether it is these endless pseudo-Marxists, pseudo-feminists, pseudo-Foucaultians, and so on, who now infest our academies.
Now, at least the left-wing group is all bundled together for the purposes of the book under the, as you call it, the school of resentment.
Well, the school of resentment, or as I charmingly like to call them, a rabblement of lemmings.
Of lemmings, that phrase appears more than once. The school of resentment is characterized by resentment, in your terms, against or towards the kind of what's perceived to be an aestheticism and an elitism.
I'm afraid that their primary resentment, forgive me for interrupting you, I deeply fear that their primary resentment is of imaginative literature itself. What they resent is the aesthetic, which they condemn as a bourgeois mystification. It is not easy, I must say, for me to get over my stunned amazement at this act on their part. After some 20 years of contemplating the spreading of this ghastly phenomenon, it still not only mortifies me, but astonishes me.
But
to believe that the aesthetic is only a bourgeois mystification. That it's always, as it were, a judgment of value made purely in the interests of the ruling classes. Such a view would have been laughed out of any academy when I was young, but now is so prevalent that those who oppose it are laughed at.
But there's a sense in which the argument for aestheticism, for aesthetics, has to be made over and over. I mean, this is one of the things that Wilde was doing and was so outrageous.
Oh, yeah. I absolutely agree with you. I point out in the book that these so-called new historicists and so-called Marxists and others, who are appropriating these terms and who form the current camp of resentment, that they are very much in dissent from Aristotelian, you might say, social science or social eugenics on the one hand, and Platonic moralism on the other. The deep condemnation of the aesthetic, meaning of Homer,
Right.
on the part of Plato, is the ultimate ancestor for these gentlemen and ladies.
Right. In the Republic, where he wants to get
In the
poets
Republic
outside the civil.
and by implication elsewhere.
Yes.
Just as the response that I make to them is ultimately a knowing repetition on my part of the great Alexandrian critic whom we identify wrongly by the name of Longinus, but the name has stuck in his treatise, which we translate, as On the Sublime,
Right.
though I think the title is something closer to On Strong Writing. It is Longinus who points out nearly 2,000 years ago that the contest or agon Plato is with Homer, and that having in effect been defeated in aesthetic supremacy by Homer, never able to match up to him, magnificent writer as he is, Plato seeks to simply expel Homer, to drive him out on moral grounds.
I should just.
Which is indeed to reject the aesthetic in the name of the moral and in their
utilitarian.
debased way. That, I believe, is what the School of Resentment is up to.
Now, I wanted to ask you, one of the central arguments of the book, The Western Canon, is actually, in some ways, a recursion back to your argument of the anxiety of influence, and that is that the canon itself is necessary for the production of art in terms of the agon or the conflict of the creation of art. You need something to be, an artist needs something to be competing against, some prior master
Yes.
to be defeating in battle at some
Yes,
level.
I think that's exactly right. Though you're kind enough to ascribe that to the anxiety of influence. The anxiety of influence, the book, I mean, not the concept, overtly takes that notion of the arts, and the literary art in particular, as being agonistic, directly from Jakob Burckhardt and from Friedrich Nietzsche, who took it from his colleague Burckhardt, and they in turn are merely returning one to ancient Athens, where the entire conception of literature was agonistic.
Where the great plays were created for contests.
Where the great plays are created in contest, where Pindar writes his odes in competition with Bacchylides and others, where Homer's contest with Hesiod is fought out so powerfully by the author of the Iliad. And Hesiod, remarkable as he is, loses.
Now, I think part of the idea of the resentment that comes in here is there's a sense in which things, because the canon exists, because of the process of the anxiety of influence, the agon of the arts, there's a certain kind of aspect that this is set in stone. What you have to do to become a great writer now is approach the canon in a certain way. It seems like a process of going away from the canon, of turning aside, of sitting in your own house and just writing by yourself. There's an odd sort of feeling that you have to do this now in order to be great. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Well, but it's not as though one says that the incipient playwright or poet or novelist or story writer now has got to engage the entire canon. That is clearly impossible. Nor would one even say that the aspiring writer must directly engage Dante and Shakespeare, the strongest writers in the canon, though I think ultimately, when you reach a writer of the stature of Joyce or of Beckett or of Proust, they inevitably find. They are driven by the inward necessity of their art and their ambition to take on Dante and Shakespeare. But how, after all, does one become a good writer? You
Yes.
can only do it by reading at least some very good writers before you, and in some sense basing yourself upon them, even antithetically in reaction against them.
You talk about the kind of writer that breaks into the canon. You call them strong writers, with an emphasis on the word strong, which is almost a kind of a technical ascription there.
It is a term which, again, I take from Nietzsche, who speaks of the strong poets.
Meaning?
The figure, the woman or the man who is so cognitively and linguistically and imaginatively and ultimately really has the emotional power, the disciplined emotional power, to absorb what is most vital in tradition and in history without being merely nullified or overwhelmed by it, and who can, in some deep sense, recast an extraordinary quantity of it in such a way that she or he alters it, shifts its balance, makes it ultimately different.
And one of the ways they make it different, as you mentioned more than once in this book, is by creatively misreading the precursor.
I would think that more often than not, the new writer of not only extraordinary ambition, but the power to realize that ambition, to make that ambition something deeply feasible, something real, does it intuitively by a process more antithetical than not, which is a kind of powerful misinterpretation or misreading or revision of, let us call it, the ancestor work. Though by ancestor, I am very wary now of being miscategorized by others. I do not mean anything Oedipal. One reason why there's not only a disowning of the Oedipal notion in a brief discussion of the anxiety of influence early in my Western Canon book is because it has been almost invariably misunderstood by people writing about my notion. And also that is why there's a chapter on Freud in my book, which
Yes.
has been much attacked and will probably go on being attacked, in which I try to demonstrate that Freud suffers from what I call a Shakespeare complex, and that we ought to, in fact, call Freud's Oedipus complex the Hamlet complex.
Right.
That is to say, as I say in the book, Hamlet has not got an Oedipal complex, but Freud certainly has a Hamlet complex.
Which he recast as the Oedipal complex.
Which he recasts as the Oedipal.
In order to hide its provenance.
In order to hide, among other things, his intense ambivalence toward Shakespeare and his overwhelming, his indeed, in the end, scandalous debt to Shakespeare.
I wanted to ask you, there's a quote from Kenneth Burke in the Western Canon, and you say that you admire him. I admire him greatly as well. And you,
I deeply loved Kenneth Burke, both as a person and as a critic, and I was very proud and pleased when my group of books, including The Anxiety of Influence and A Map of Misreading and Kabbalah and Criticism and the book on Stevens and Poetry and Impression, were all coming out in the 1970s. Mr. Burke, who I had not yet met, reviewed a whole series of these books, reviewed all of them in very moving and helpful terms, and in effect recognized himself in them. And I see increasingly that in that phase of my work I was, and I'm still very proud of this, Kenneth Burke's disciple.
Well, what you quote him as saying is, these are his words. When he approaches a work, he asks the question, what was the writer trying to do for himself
Yes.
as a person by writing this
Yes.
poem, play, or story?
Kenneth and I once had a kind of loving debate about that before an audience of critics and students and scholars, in which he said that that is how he would amend what I was doing by always asking, what is the writer trying to do for herself or himself as a person by writing this particular poem or play or novel or story? And I said, Kenneth, I would rather modify that, take it from you, but modify it. I would always want to know what is Shakespeare or what is Emily Dickinson trying to do for himself or herself as a writer, as a playwright or poet, by writing this particular play or this particular poem. I think that the two notions, which are clearly related, mine is indeed derived from Burke's, are really different.
Yeah, I understand the difference, and it's much more truthful in a way to the writer's experience, which is, I remember there's sort of an apocryphal story about Malcolm Lowry, excuse my lapse there, who once said, when he was asked why he wrote Under the Volcano, he said, well, originally his ambition was to write a book, which is the general writer's ambition, is to write works of art. And to ask what he wants as a person out of that is a slight misplacement of the motive.
Well, it's also something perhaps that she or he is less likely to know, and we too are less likely to know. That is to say, we can arrive, I think, by cognitive work, by the analytical intellect, by the full process of imaginative apprehension of a literary work of art. We can arrive at some understanding, sometimes indeed a profound understanding, of what indeed Shakespeare was trying to do for himself as a playwright, say by writing something as astonishingly problematic as Measure for Measure,
Right,
as his last stage comedy. But if we were to ask what Shakespeare was trying to do for himself as a person, it would be more than our absolute lack of real biographical information about him that would stymie us.
yes.
I think Kenneth's question, though profound, is less answerable.
I wanted to turn the question on you as we close here and ask you what you were trying to do for yourself as a writer and a critic by writing this book.
Very, very, very shrewd again on your part. It's an absolutely justified question. And again, it bears out in a sense what I'm saying, because I have no idea what I was trying to do for myself as a person by writing the Western Canon book. But I think that as a critic, I was trying not only to give a kind of summa of what's in my 40 years of teaching now, and really it's 50 years now. I really was an intense reader by the time I was 14. I'm 64 now. What in half a century of reading and brooding and thinking about literature I have come to understand, but also to make the next thing possible for myself, because I'm, as an interlude now, writing a brief meditation, a short book called Angels, Dreams, and Not Dying, on some American current obsessions like our strange popular angelology and our obsession with the so-called near-death experience.
Yes.
But essentially what I'm trying to do with this Western Canon book is what I will hope to go on to very soon, was to write a huge book called Shakespeare and Originality, on all the characters in Shakespeare's plays, trying to bring back the notion of literary character and dramatic character, rather than merely treating these as roles for actors.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to call a halt now. We've run out of time. Thank you for being on the show.
I'm very grateful to you. I have found this a moving and useful interview. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.